The nature of science itself is slowly beginning to accommodate the notion that consciousness is more than simply something that your brain is producing. In quantum mechanics, that before that object is measured or observed, it doesn't have fixed properties. It has all possible properties. What it doesn't tell us, though, is how do the possibilities turn into actualities? They propose that maybe consciousness, meaning awareness, which is non-physical as best as we can tell, so it's only possibilities. Well, what breaks it? It becomes real awareness, consciousness. So that is a viable interpretation of quantum mechanics, even from a mainstream perspective. And so that there are already standard quantum experiments. It's as though the present moment is influenced by the past and the future. And the way that it's sometimes described is that the present is bounded, has boundaries in space and time, and the temporal boundaries actually create the present. But they're boundary conditions where the future boundary and the past boundary are sort of reverberating in some way to create the present. So we have elements of quantumness in us, in which case our perceptions should extend through space and time. We do see that we can feel the future, typically from milliseconds up to perhaps 10 seconds in the future in the laboratory, and then from a viewing experiment, sometimes months in advance. So those are very commonly reported and now confirmed, and have at least a theoretical basis to look at and say, well, it's not impossible. It is part of, apparently, of the way that the world works. When most people think about the word magic, they think about stage magic, about tricks, which are good and fun. Here we're talking about the origins of those illusions, which is real magic. So real magic means, and you'll see quickly that the definition is almost identical to psychic phenomena, because there are three categories of real magic. There's enchantment, which in the laboratory we would say is a psychokinetic effect or mind-matter interaction effect. In the popular terminology, it might be called manifestation. It's the idea that your intention or your mind can influence the physical world. The second category is divination, which in the laboratory is clairvoyance, remote viewing, precognition, psychic perception tasks. And in the vernacular, things like tarot and mirror gazing and all of those methods. And the third category is theurgy, which refers to working with spirits, essentially. It's somewhere between the idea of spiritual ideas, religious ideas, but mainly about the notion that there are invisible entities and maybe that our consciousness can exist without a body, those kinds of things. So in the magical traditions, you also hear words like evocation and invocation. So evocation is evoking a spirit through some kind of a ritual, and invocation is asking a spirit to work through you, which again, in a psychic sense, might be considered channeling. So those are the three categories, and all three of them have been studied in parapsychology, mostly in laboratory work. So that's the relationship, that there's a cultural and historical way of thinking about these phenomena, which in the modern world we call psychic, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, beautiful. And thank you for that introduction, because what I hear from the way you describe it is that it's really part of a lens of a cultural context, a historical context, that goes much deeper than what society sees it as on the surface level. And it's really important because, especially for my audience that are, younger individuals kind of trying to find their place in the world, but also very interested, right? Very ambitious, very outspoken in these types of topics. I find that it's more important than ever to really understand these definitions very well, because people, as you know, on social media, online, it's like the Wild West, and people can say anything and everything. And they might cite a few things, but it might be twisted and turned in a way that might not be the full truth there. So in speaking of that, what was your inspiration for writing this next part of your book? Because you've written many books on magic before, but why this book now?
Well, actually, this is my second book that focuses more on magic. My previous books were more about psychic research. The reason I wrote this second book, for the previous one was published in 2018. I'm not primarily an author. I'm a scientist doing laboratory work, so I don't have a lot of time to take off to write a book. But the reason I did this is because one of the proposals that I have is that the nature of science itself is slowly beginning to accommodate the notion that consciousness is more than simply something that your brain is producing. And so, and the way we see that is a number of specialty journals that are now on consciousness as a topic, that the topic is taken seriously in the academic world in many different disciplines, everything from psychology, sociology, physics, and beyond. And the number of conferences that are being held on one or more aspects of consciousness. Like every month, you can find a major conference on this. And as another example, that it used to be quite difficult both to get articles published in psychic and mystical and magical topics, except for specialty journals, typically in things like history of religion. But that's dramatically changed as well. So as one example, about 6 weeks ago, I was invited to give a talk at Harvard Medical School. Well, so that's about as mainstream as you can get. And I was talking about psychic phenomena, but then linking it back into virtually every spiritual tradition, which says in that tradition that depending on the practice of it, usually meditation or something, that you will begin to bump into these phenomena. You'll experience it as part of your practice. And so we can look at that through a modern rational lens and ask, were they just making it up? Was this part of their fantasy or supernatural ideas about the world? Or given that it shows up again and again in different cultures, were they actually reporting something like a hint that something about that is real? And so that was the approach that I took, and also talked about the laboratory work. And one of the ways I'd like to describe the effect on the audience of 400 or 500 people is that, first of all, nobody's heads exploded. So they were able to accommodate this. And there was no panic. In fact, there was a lot of interest in this. So what this reveals essentially is that interest in these topics have always been there. But there's been a very long taboo in the academic world in particular, and it's reflected then in the way that it's portrayed in the popular science press. The portrayal is, well, we don't need to pay any attention to this seriously because it doesn't exist, or it's impossible, or something like that. That has never been the case. That's been a story that has been overlaid, and it's very strongly bound by culture. So in so-called Western culture, United States, portions of Europe, people regard this, or is taught, they are taught that this is something that's not worth paying attention to except as fantasy. You go to India, many places in Asia, completely different. In fact, so different that when I've given lectures in India in particular, the audiences, oftentimes composed of academics, kind of ask, like, why are you even bothering to do science on this stuff? We all know that it's real. So we have like two sides of the coin on that. Depending if you're in one culture, people are so skeptical that they say, well, we don't want you shouldn't have any funding because this stuff is stupid. And the other side, people are so accepting of it, they say, well, why are you doing it? Because we already know it's true. Well, that says the moment that you see that kind of a split according to culture, you know that it's actually even a more interesting topic, because it means that the likelihood of the phenomena is there. People simply are taught to respond to it differently.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, at least on the Western front, the taboos appeared to be the main barrier. And me being an acupuncturist and doing energy healing like qigong or pranic healing, which also is very popular in India, we understand the idea that consciousness, your attention, can influence matter through this invisible energy or qi, right? And as you know, Dean, for traditional Chinese medicine was formally, constructed as TCM. It included more of those parapsychological, those psi phenomenons, when you had like these really ancient master qigong healers, without any physical touch, seemingly being able to do things that science couldn't explain. And what it tells me, Dean, is that when you mentioned about the spectrum, right, it's either this magic that this psi is taboo, or of course it's real, right? Because we've been talking about it for thousands of years. Where it meets in the middle is the data, right? And I think that there's not a lack of data, but the data maybe not as pristine or refined as science holds it to be to certain standards. So can you talk about that in relation to your work and how you've kind of helped kind of break down these taboos?
Yeah. So if you come at these phenomena from a physics perspective, then they're far too squishy. There's too much variance in it. If you come at it from a psychological perspective, they're actually on par with what you see in psychological experiments because people are squishy. And so when we do experiments involving people, especially you see this in medicine all the time, if you get a highly effective response from some kind of medical treatment, that's kind of rare. What you usually get are fairly small responses. And so it takes a lot of people to run experiments, to do repeated trials, and then fancy statistical methods in order to be able to show that there's actually something happening. So one of the examples we like to use is that aspirin has been a well-accepted treatment for hundreds of years. Up until something like 50 or 70 years ago, the mechanism was not known. Finally, we figured out what the biochemical reasons are that aspirin works. But when you look at the effect size, it's tiny. It's a tiny little thing. But it's well accepted because it was thought up until recently that it couldn't harm you, but it might help you in terms of reducing inflammation and so on. Now it is actually thought that if aspirin came out as a new drug now, it probably would not get FDA approval because it produces brain bleeds. It has people are allergic to it. There's all kinds of reasons now that as a drug would probably not be allowed. So it just shows that medical standards change over time. And one of the reasons why typically in clinical trials, you may end up with thousands of people on the clinical trial in order to establish that it's safe and effective. And the effectiveness, again, is tiny, tiny little bits. One other example is recently, Alzheimer's, of course, is a problem that's getting worse. And there were finally 2 drugs that were approved by the FDA. Both of them cost tens of thousands of dollars, and both of them will reduce the progression of Alzheimer's by a few months. So if somebody has Alzheimer's, they want to do anything they possibly can, and it will cost something like $50,000 or $80,000, and it will slow down the progression, but it won't stop it, and it won't even cure it. I mean, it won't do anything other than slow it down a little bit. So that's an example of something that took a huge amount of money and people to get approval as a drug, an FDA-approved drug. So it shouldn't be surprising when you're now doing studies on psychic phenomena, which are a fairly subtle mental effect, that the effects are going to be pretty small when you look at them in the laboratory, and they are. So it takes a lot of people and a lot of statistics and so on to show it. On the other hand, the moment you take a phenomena that is usually experienced by people spontaneously, which is how psychic things normally happen, and you have to squish it into a form that you can study in the laboratory, you're squishing it. I mean, if you're not careful, you'll squish it out of existence. So you want to squish it enough so that you get very high control over the nature of the phenomenon, but still allow it to express. And so that's how most of these experiments work. And fortunately, the phenomena are strong enough that we are able to see it. So I would say that one of the reasons why the evidence from the outside, or I would say almost from a naive perspective, is not good enough, not strong enough or persuasive enough, is because of a conflation between the existential question and the efficacy question. So in basic science, we are interested in whether something exists. That's the existential question. The efficacy question is how big is it? So someone will look at an effect like in a telepathy experiment where we get 5% over chance. But we have very high confidence that that 5% is real because there's a lot of trials and the statistics are very clear on that. We're talking many, many trillions to 1 odds against chance. But somebody would look at it, well, it's only 5% over chance. Well, that's not very impressive. I want 100% mind reading. Where is that? Well, that's an efficacy question. And that in many ways, that's not really what basic science is about, especially at the beginning of understanding something. We want to know, does it exist? Yes, it exists. The next question is, well, how did it work? What modulates it? All of those are now pointing more towards the process, which eventually gets to high efficacy.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it points to the analogy I think in my head is that science is so you talk about like the ontological view, right, which is this materialism perspective that anything real that has a cause and effect must be should have been framed in terms of our current development of science and being able to observe it, replicate it, right? And it should be, if this is real, why can't everyone do it, right? So, which is very interesting because it brings me to my next question on the work you've done and the things you talk about in your book, how consciousness can affect physical systems, and you talk about photons, water, cells. So can you help the audience sort of ground these ideas, Dean, and speak about what experiments have been done to show that these effects on consciousness appear to seem magical, but it shows that efficacy like you're talking about?
Well, there's two elements to that. One are experiments which are designed to demonstrate that an effect exists. So that's true. Then we have experiments all the way from electrons and photons all the way up to human healing. I mean, it's like the whole range, cell cultures, water, all kinds of things. In many cases, they show significant effects. So we have the existence is there. The other part of your question, though, is, well, how do we begin to understand why it exists? The truth is, at this point, we don't know. We don't have a theory that everybody will say, oh, that's it. Now we understand why it works. There are many theories that are attempting to explain why these effects make sense from a rational scientific perspective. The one that I've been tracking most closely is about the observer effect in quantum mechanics. So a major difference between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics is that in classical mechanics, when you look at a system, you're observing it, you're measuring it, you're not changing its properties. The properties are assumed to already be there, and so you're simply describing the properties. In quantum mechanics, that's no longer true. In quantum mechanics, when we're talking about typically things like electrons and photons, that before that object is measured or observed, it doesn't have fixed properties. It has all possible properties. This is part of the peculiarity of what the equations of quantum mechanics tell us, is that equations don't say why something is the way it is. It says there are possibilities, a whole range of possibilities that something can be like. And its description of those possibilities is really good. That's why quantum mechanics is used in electronics development and so on. It's very, very accurate. What it doesn't tell us, though, is how do the possibilities turn into actualities? In other words, think of this as like a huge cloud of possibilities that when measured, boom, it suddenly collapses into very specific properties. And the equations don't tell us how that happens. So the developers of quantum mechanics were puzzled over this. Like, we have a really great theory that doesn't say how the world works, essentially. It says how the world can probably work, but not how it actually works. So one of the proposals from John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner and a bunch of other people was that it seems as though the act of observing actually does cause a change. It's causal. And it's causal in the sense of taking a cloud of possibilities and making a single event occur. So von Neumann and others said, well, why would it do that? Maybe there's something non-physical involved, because anytime you have two physical systems that interact, quantum mechanics describes it perfectly well, but again, only as possibilities. So if I were to observe a photon with my eye, I have a physical eye and a physical brain, and it's a physical thing. It's just a big mishmash of more possibilities. still doesn't collapse. So what's the difference? They propose that maybe consciousness, meaning awareness, which is non-physical as best as we can tell, maybe that's the thing that causes it breaks the chain. They talk about a chain of measurement, physical, physical, physical. It's like physical everywhere. So it's only possibilities. Well, what breaks it and becomes real? Awareness, consciousness. So that is a viable interpretation of quantum mechanics, even from a mainstream perspective. And while physicists have talked about this for a long time, very, very few have actually put it to the test. Because putting it to the test requires that you propose that consciousness can do something in the physical world. And that's kind of been taboo as well. Like in physics, you don't talk about that stuff. Well, but that is in many ways the bread and butter of a whole realm of parapsychological work, because we're interested in mind-matter interactions. And so we've been doing experiments, and now 5 other labs have also done experiments looking at the role of consciousness in collapsing the quantum wave function, typically using optical systems. So that's both the theoretical side. It is testable. We have been testing it, and it looks like there's something there. The data, I would say at this point, is not at the level where you could publish it in top-tier physics journals, because typically they do require very high reliability and repeatability, and we're not there yet. But as I say in all of my papers, that's because this isn't just a physics experiment. It's physics involving something as subtle as consciousness, which is not that easy to study directly because we don't even know what it is. We have it, but what is it? Well, that's unknown at this point. So we do the best that we can, and we see fairly large variance from one experiment to the next. But I would say overall, it looks like there is something interesting going on, which is like the analogy I use is when Benjamin Franklin was flying kites in an electrical storm and seeing little sparks down where he was holding it when a lightning strike occurred. He would have no idea, first of all, what that was, and second of all, would not be able to guess that 100 years later, the entire world would be running on those little sparks because we understood better what they are and how to create them and so on. So I would say at this point, both for psychic and magical topics, that what we see are sparks. And we have some idea about how to evoke the sparks, but we don't have a very good theory about it yet. And with this point, we can only guess as to where we're going to go with it in 100 years, although I think it's going to be a lot less than 100 years. But that's where we are.
Yeah. And to speak on, the timing of it, I know you said the magic of today will be the science of tomorrow. And like you said, with the evolution of not just the scientific framework, but consciousness itself and how we understand the nature of reality. And, based on what you've spoken about, for the audience, it seems to, based on your book and what you've discussed in prior engagements, is that it appears that, consciousness can measurably affect the behavior of photons, right? Which is different from, years of research on random number generators, right? Because even though the research basis on random number generators, there's a lot of data there, but it hasn't seemed to pique the interest of the, scientific community. But when you're talking about a photon, it was like, oh, well, that's something more measurable. It's something, a little bit more quantifiable. So it might open a little bit more doors there.
Right. Even though the underlying phenomena is almost certainly the same thing. Because the randomness in random number generators usually comes from things like either radioactive decay latencies, the time between radioactive emissions, which is fundamentally random, but that seems to be manipulable by the mind. And also, for electronic versions, the source of randomness is electron tunneling, which is a quantum effect. There's other things too, but it's mainly that. And so if something is able to change quantum behavior, which is both radioactive decay of particles and quantum tunneling, it probably ought to affect what's going on with a photon too. And it does. But it's true that the double slit system in particular is very well understood in optical physics. And so it's an easier way of simply describing the nature of an experiment involving the mind, but again, pointing back to 50 years of random number generator experiments and 50 years before that with tossing dice, that you see a very consistent effect from one target system to the next, suggesting that there's something about consciousness, focused consciousness, that affects at least the probabilistic or maybe the informational structure of the physical world. That's what we see.
Yeah, and as you speak about target systems, it piques my next question: is the power of our consciousness and intention. And you've spoken about certain ideas of changing the past in the future, and the things we call synchronicity, even in the present moment, being something that can be described from this framework. So, for the audience, Dean, can you kind of explore this field of time and synchronicity in the past and future, and where and how intention seems to kind of play a role in that?
Well, from both a classical and quantum physics perspective, the equations are time symmetric, or in some equations, time doesn't even appear at all. And so there are already experiments in like standard quantum experiments, like the delayed choice experiment, which are able to reveal that at the elementary level, it's as though the present moment is influenced by the past and the future. And the way that it's sometimes described is that the present is bounded, it has boundaries in space and time, and the temporal boundaries actually create the present. That they're boundary conditions where the future boundary and the past boundary are sort of reverberating in some way to create the present. So the notion, sometimes people will say, well, maybe I can accept a mind matter effect or a telepathic effect, but this whole time thing, I don't know if I could accept that. Well, the irony is that that's the one area in physics that are very clear that actually does exist in the equations and in experiments in the mainstream. The mystery here is, well, first of all, we know that this is happening at the micro scale. So how come we experience we're macro? We're not micro. So, well, maybe our experience is in some way linked to what's going on in the brain, some of which is almost certainly true. Like a lot of cognition and perception this is an information processing machine up here, which may not have anything to do with consciousness per se, because after all, I can make a computer that has good vision and hearing and everything else, but we don't think that it actually has an internal subjective sense. So the mechanism of information processing, you can say, okay, the brain is really good at that. Not just the brain, but the whole nervous system is engaged in that. Well, what makes a difference in where do we bubble up from a micro world into our experience? Well, it's possible that we know the brain has all kinds of things going on that are at the micro level, synapses and ions and so on. So there very well could be aspects of the brain that are operating at the quantum scale. I think we will know for sure that that's the case within 10 years. And there's already some evidence that it's true. So we have elements of quantumness in us, in which case our perceptions should extend through space and time. Because our sense of presence, which is roughly 500 milliseconds plus or minus a little bit, is not bound to the present. We normally think of it as only being bound to the past, but it looks like it could be bound to the future too. And so lots and lots of experiments on precognition, both conscious and unconscious, have shown that it's among the most robust things that we could demonstrate in the laboratory. We do see that we can feel the future, typically from milliseconds up to perhaps 10 seconds in the future in the laboratory. And then depending on other experiments, like remote viewing experiments, sometimes months in advance. That's verifiable. So, well, what do we do with that then? We may not think in an ordinary state that this is possible, but at least from a physics perspective and for what we see in the laboratory and what we see spontaneously reported by people, like the most commonly reported psychic experience is a precognitive dream. And another type is a premonition of danger. usually in the short term, minutes in the future. So those are very commonly reported and now confirmed in the laboratory, and have at least a theoretical basis to look at and say, well, it's not impossible. We still don't know how it bubbles up into our awareness exactly, but it's not impossible at this point. It is part of, apparently, of the way that the world works.
Hmm. And this is again, for me, as someone that comes from a background of meditation, spiritual practices, from Buddhist lineages. This resonates with me so much because it provides that basis again that all these traditions have been talking about, but now like we can definitively, not definitively, but it strongly suggests that there is something beyond the current framework of science that we understand it, and it's echoing, as I say, the science of what science was thousands of years ago, through these different traditions.
And
And
I would add to that, though, though we're talking about things which are actually not beyond where science is today. So the scientific worldview over the past century has changed so radically that if we were asked a physicist, like world-class physicists 100 years ago, what do they think of non-locality and entanglement and all of the phenomena that we're talking about here within quantum mechanics, which are well accepted now, they would say, that's crazy. Well, here we are. So what will we know in 100 years? Well, we'll say that's crazy too, because there will be all kinds of new things that we'll be discovering. The point of it is that if you look at the arrow, the trend of the developments in physics, it went from before classical physics, like just everyday descriptions of everyday things, and then more formalized with equations, and then quantum mechanics. That direction is becoming more and more compatible with psychic and magical experiences. And it's true, we're not completely there yet because this is not totally mainstream, but the direction that we're going is pointing. I mean, if it was pointing in the other direction, saying that stuff is completely ruled out, well, then we say, well, okay, we're not there yet. Maybe we'll never get there. But that's not the case. We're pointing directly at a future science between 10, maybe 50 years from now, where we'll say, oh, well, it's obvious this stuff should exist.
Sure. And when you say that, I think of your colleague Arnold Delorme, which his work at MD Anderson, and with biofield therapies and the Bankston method, right? Which is they call it energy healing, but it's very much a mental practice of visualizing and cycling through different states. And I was just speaking to Lorenzo Cohen at a conference, and how you're talking about the same thing. Like they're trying to measure if there is entanglement in using the present state of technology and our understanding of science. And like it said, the arrow is pointing in this direction. So it is very exciting to see, and especially at again, you were speaking at Harvard, and MD Anderson being one of the top cancer research institutes in the world, not even in this country. So again, it points to this direction of science, which is very interesting because, as you've mentioned, and as I've studied too, when we've tried to study these phenomenons or psychics or children with special abilities in labs, the results tend to kind of fall apart. And it seems to be the fact that there's this notion of consciousness and being in an environment with different people's perspectives and opinions, and that seems to affect even the spontaneity nature of these phenomena. So I would love to hear your comments on that, Dean.
Yeah, it's difficult to create an environment in a laboratory context, largely because you're asking somebody to do something on demand, like do it now, be psychic now. Can you do it now? Now? What about now? That produces a demand characteristic on the subject, which is very effective in wiping it out. People get anxious, and so it's difficult to sustain. But fortunately, it is not. It doesn't extinguish it completely. That's why we get small effects in the lab. That's why you need a lot of repeated trials. Or you do a significant search for people who have talent. So typically what you do is, we're talking here about just the same normal curve of any other form of talent. Uh, Anybody can think, well, I could learn to play tennis and then I'll go to Wimbledon, or I'll start running and I'll end up in the Olympics. No, a very, very tiny percentage of people who will have both the physical and the mental talent to be able to do that. And so we don't question that. We don't question that some people are much more skilled and talented in sports and music. It's exactly the same thing here. Some people simply have some kind of a intuitive talent or genetic inheritance or something, which is not well understood yet, but they're different and they have this talent. And so you'd need to spend a lot of time to find those people. But once you do find those people and you use them in laboratory tests, they are way better than people who are just pulled off the street. So this has been shown again and again in this line of work. It's difficult and expensive to find people that have that talent, but then bring them into the laboratory, which is generally why it's not done. Usually what you end up with are college sophomores who are doing experiments because they get credit for their course. And so they may have no interest in it. They may have never had an experience of this type. But even with those populations, you still get effects, small effects, sometimes highly significant effects, but it tends not to be convincing for people who don't appreciate the statistics, because you'd say, well, it's 2%, maybe it was a fluke. Well, no, that's what you use statistics for. You can figure out if something is chance or not chance. That's the whole point of it. So if you have the time and money to find people, to vet that people actually have talent, and you use them in experiments, you do a lot better. So I'll go back to the example of the Ganzfeld telepathy experiments. So something like 4,700 sessions, most with people who are unselected for special ability. Chance is 25% in that design. The overall results are around 30%. So 5% over chance. If you now take the subset of those subjects who are people who have a close emotional bonding or previous spontaneous experiences of telepathy or some other reason to believe that they can do it, they get 45 to 50%. So, that's a confirmation that people, when you begin to select them out who have the right kind of talent for the experiment, they show bigger effects, and effects that start to look more dramatic even from a distance. You say, well, you don't hardly need statistics anymore to be able to show that those people can do this way beyond chance. So it's more difficult to find people who can do that for mind-matter interaction effects than it is for perceptual effects. But there are people out there that do have those talents. Like you had mentioned that the MD cancer experiment was a highly talented healer who couldn't do this stuff. And he did many, many repeated trials to be able to show it, even with that talent. But the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, and it's always very interesting for me, Dean, because as a person that practices acupuncture, right, which is a form of energy medicine, acupuncture is very a way to frame it. It's very different because you have a needle. There's an acupuncture point. You stick the needle to the point, and with certain techniques of manipulating the needle physically, most people should be able to be trained and learn to do this. But to going on the other side where it's non-physical, right, which is energy healing, biofield therapies, especially for that practitioner that was highlighted in the study, he's very exceptional, right, and he can produce things way beyond the average person. It's the idea that people are just built different. And I spoke to Helene Wabe, and she spoke about the genetics component too, to certain more exceptional channelers, and how their abilities may go above and beyond the average person. So it's very interesting, and it adds to the diverse layers of the topics that we're talking about today. And I wanted to kind of get back to something that you spoke about, which is like the Jello universe view, right? And how magic and sci it's pushing probabilities and not breaking laws that, again, many people in the taboo view might see it as. And this comes into the topic of manifestation very nicely, because people, especially on the internet, they'll talk about 100 million ways of different ways of manifesting. So can you help us sort of grasp and bring back to, just for the average audience, how this can apply to their day-to-day life when we look at it from probabilities, from this perspective?
Well, the probability that the world will remain pretty much the same as it is now, a millisecond from now, very high probability. But the further you go out in time, the more you can think of it as branching structures of all kinds of possible things can occur. It starts to sound like quantum mechanics after a while, that you can describe your future in the sense of possibilities or probabilities. Things will happen. We know from lots and lots of experiments, you mentioned random number generators, there's other ones with dice and so on, that something about intention can change probabilistic structures. So like with a binary random number generator, if you want more ones, you will eventually get more ones. If you want more zeros, you get that too. It's not an easy one-to-one correspondence, because we're all built with lots and lots of psychological filters. And those filters will get in the way of your intention. So you might be thinking, give me ones. I want more ones to be produced by this thing. And meanwhile, part of your unconscious is saying, no, that's stupid. I'm not going to do that today. And that will block it easily. So it takes a lot of practice in both in the laboratory and in the real world to say, I want a certain outcome. Well, why I'm not getting it? Well, why not? Well, maybe it wasn't clear enough. Maybe your focus wasn't intense enough. Maybe your attention is wandering. There's a huge range. There's like 7 or 8 factors which both real magicians talk about, and which some of them have been tested in the laboratory, that say that if all of these factors are not in alignment, then your wish, which is essentially a manifestation wish, well, it's not going to happen, because you're not able to push all of the various possibilities and probabilities to the extent where it's needed that outcome will occur. So number one, belief. If you do a manifestation, but meanwhile, sort of back of your mind, you're thinking, this is not going to work, then it's not going to work. So belief is number one. And we're talking about a kind of absolute belief that this practice that I'm doing right now is going to work. It may not work instantaneously. It may take a week. It may take, who knows how long. And the length of time it'll likely take before something like that occurs is going to be linked back to the probability that it would occur anyway. So one example I like to give is the following. So sometimes they say, well, what if you wanted to manifest a gold-plated Mercedes? That's what you want. Okay, well, first of all, you think a little bit about, why do I want that? You need to be clear about what the intention is. You might do some kind of a magical practice, or just simply an intentional practice that's what I want. I really want it. Doesn't matter why, I just want that. So I've used that as an example of number of times. And I use it because when you figure out the probability of somehow the gold-plated Mercedes just shows up on your driveway and it's yours, what needs to take place in order for that to occur? A lot, and a lot of very low probability events. So our intention, yes, we can push it a little bit. And could you push all of the various probabilities enough to be able to make that happen? Well, maybe somebody with a huge amount of talent can do it. So as I was doing this as a demonstration this is what I want. A friend of mine said, well, you wanted a gold-plated Mercedes? There it is. It's a little car. The wheels turn, the doors open. It's a Mercedes. It's gold-plated. It's not real gold, but it's a gold-colored thing. He said, well, there you go. I manifested it. Why? Because I wasn't clear enough that I wanted a real car that could be driven. But this probability was much, much easier to get. So the universe conspired in such a way that there you go. Okay, I have a gold-plated Mercedes. It's not exactly what I had in mind, but I wasn't clear enough. So then I was talking about this one time, and then I got another one. And then somebody sent me this one. So now I have two gold-plated Mercedes. This one happens to be a sports car. So, be clear about what it is that you want and also the likelihood of getting it. Well, my brother sent me this one because he saw me talking about that one. He said, oh, look at this. There's another one. So I'm going to end up with way too many little toy Mercedes at this point because the idea of a manifestation is that you throw it out to the universe and say, this is what I want. And it's way easier to get that. And I may be getting them like once a week now for the rest of my life.
You're going to need a really big garage, Dean, to
Well, or a
keep it
little
up with the.
museum of enormous number of gold-plated Mercedes. Maybe one day I'll get it actually gold.
Yeah, yeah. But it speaks to you spoke about belief, but this focus and this intention, right? And I think it's a really great example, and thank you for bringing that up because we hear stories of all the time of people, not being uh as specific with their manifestations and getting things that are, yes, that is how it came up, but it might not came up the way that we want it to be. And what's interesting to me, because we live in a capitalistic society, and of course we're humans, we're driven by our egos and our desires. So a gold plated Mercedes will satisfy many people. But what I've heard from you is that people dabble into magic or psi phenomenon because they want to gain things, right, for material reasons, and
Yeah,
that's the motivation part. But I've also heard you talk about you know people entering an altered state of consciousness or gnosis or samadhi, and it's a very interesting way to describe it because you've mentioned it's almost like in meditation where it's effortless effort on yes, you have an idea, right? You want this gold plated Mercedes, but you shouldn't be attached to it because that might limit how it might materialize.
yeah,
And then of course once you even do get it, you're like, oh, now what, right? So it points to a bigger perspective beyond just our trivial human egos. So can you talk about sort of that perspective for us? Because I think that's very much needed nowadays.
yeah. The term is effortless striving, which you hear about in meditation, you hear about all the time in the magical practices, that your motivation and attention and intention and so on need to be as strong as you can possibly create, like overwhelmingly, obsessively, motivationally as high as you can get, but with no effort. So it's paradoxical that you need to achieve both. And you even see this when you look back at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras from 2,000 years ago, that in that tradition, as well as all of the others, you start doing meditation and yoga and you'll start experiencing these phenomena, usually first as synchronicities, but with further practice and talent, you eventually can gain the various siddhis, the powers that yogis talk about. So how does that work? Well, first you achieve samadhi, which not everybody can do either, even with a lot of practice, but for those who can, you get into this state of samadhi, which is like pure awareness, with no intention or anything. It's just you're resting in a state of pure awareness, sometimes called naked awareness. Like there's no clothes on it, there's nothing on it. It's just that's what it is. In that state, you do a practice in the yogic traditions called samyama, which is putting an intentional spin. So you have like this pure field of just awareness, and now you're putting a little bit of intentional spin on it for this outcome. And so the various siddhis, the powers that are said to arrive, is if you want to know the past, present, and future, which is the simplest one, which siddhi, that's we would call it clairvoyance. You simply put the spin on this intentional spin within this state of pure awareness. I want to know the past, present, and future. That's my intention. That's what I want. then the power is revealed. And so the notion of being able to get down into these rarefied mental states is very important, and the magicians would call it Gnosis, but it's the same thing as Samadhi. With intention, because once you're in that state, there's very little ego left over. There's no striving at all, and yet you put striving back in that state, and that's where it gives rise to these special abilities. In a different way. They're not spontaneous anymore. These are now on demand. So if you bring somebody into the laboratory who's like a long-term yogi who knows how to do this, we did this once, they will say, well, give me a few minutes because I need to get into that meditative state. And one in particular had one of these little bell that you press a button and it makes a sound. He said, I will ring the bell when I'm there. And then you can tell me what the nature of the task is. This was a mind matter interaction task. So he sat there for 20 minutes in full lotus, and we're all waiting. Eventually, and I thought he had fallen asleep at that point, but he didn't, because then he rang the bell. And so, okay, now I want you to do this particular task. And the results were astounding. So he was there. So the effortless striving is, while we would describe it as an absolute form of motivation, you really, really need something. The way I'm expressing it is like an everyday, ordinary state. That's not what happens when you're in this state of Gnosis. It's an intentional push, but in that state, it's very, very different than just resting in the state of pure awareness. It's to raise intention at that point requires a little bit of ego. You are doing it. It's not being done to you. So it requires completely dropping ego in that state and then bringing back just enough to be able to do the task. And it takes practice to be able to do that.
And for the audience, what was the task that the yogi had to perform that was significant?
Well, that was the first time I used an optical system to test the collapse of the wave function. So we put this was a Michelson interferometer. We put it inside our shielded chamber, which is 2,000 pounds of solid steel walls, double walled, electromagnetically grounded. So it's a really good Faraday cage. So the apparatus is in there. The yogi was outside. And I told him to put your mind in one of the arms of the interferometer. And if he did that, you would see a very dramatic change in the interference. So that was the task. For 1 minute, put your mind in that spot. And now for the next minute, take it out and do back and forth a number of times. It was very clear from the data that he was doing exactly what you would expect if you actually put your hand in the beam. So he was disrupting it in some way. We don't know exactly how he did it. I asked him, are you using cities to do this? Well, he just sort of smiled. He didn't answer. But he comes from a long tradition where that particular tradition, the Himalayan meditation techniques, they do develop the cities. And he had been doing this for 70 years. So that's probably what he was doing.
Yeah, and that's incredible, and it reminds me of the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda, and how he talks about these amazing stories that look magical, right? But through this lineage and this tradition, and when you talk about these cities, it's very much the energy around it is it's kept inside, right? You don't do it to show off. You don't do it for personal gain. And I think this comes back to as we finish this conversation, when we talk about manifestation, synchronicity, desire, consciousness, intention, ego, is that the real risk in magic is not like the technical foundations, it's the ethical foundations, right? Because once you have this ability, and through inner cultivation and through sort of a pure authentic search, there's no need for that. And it stems to what we talk about, right, in sort of the state of not only science, right, the consciousness of humanity. And it seems like we might need to develop in terms of our character in order for more of these things to happen.
Yes, we're talking about a kind of power, a force of nature Power is seductive. We're weak little primate creatures, and we are seduced by power. And that's one of the reasons why you see these cautions in every spiritual tradition, that you will get these abilities, but push through it. Because that's not the end goal. You want to keep going because there's a goal of enlightenment at the end of this rainbow. So some people can get through that and others can't. And so you do see abuse of these powers in magical traditions. Uh, it does suggest that we're not evolved enough as a species to be able to handle this level of power, which may be one of the reasons why it's been suppressed for so long. Like the methods used in magic for many, many years, were for centuries, were secret. And even within yogic traditions, the idea that you would be able to have these abilities were known way belong they were written down. It was passed through many, many generations orally, and also kept pretty secret, because as long as we've been Homo sapiens, we're weak. We're seduced too easily. So that is one of the attractors, certainly, for being interested in magic. It's for power, money, and sex. Basically, that when you look at a standard grimoire of spells, it's saturated with that. You had 500 spells for money and 500 spells for power, and on and on and on. That's what it's about. Fortunately, there are also some for healing and for more beneficial effects. But yeah, maybe a case can be made, and has been made in religions and spiritual traditions. Don't go there. Yeah. The other reason is that it is, for some people, especially those who are just slightly mentally unstable, they will go mad. They will become psychotic, especially if people get involved in things in the theurgy side. If you're trying to evoke or invoke spirits, you will go crazy unless you have a really good teacher who tells you what it is that you should or should not be doing.
Sure. Yeah. And, to speak to that, I come from an energy healing modality called pranic healing, and the founder, Master Choa Koksui, talks about the same things, how these teachings are, are dialed way, 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 way down to the level that humanity, the average person, can handle without A, hurting themselves, and B, harming others. So it speaks to the ethical responsibility that you're talking about. And the analogy, I think, is like humanity is like a baby with, looking at a sharp, shiny knife, right? And it can, the knife can do amazing things for the baby, but it's just not level ready yet. And also, it talks about, same thing what's interesting to me when we talk about, and why I'm so interested in biofield therapies and the nature of energy to heal, is that the same thing you talk about is this invocation or to different entities that can be used, for positive, good purposes and facilitating a healing session. But there's always things that we don't understand, right? And the other world seems to be like the Wild West, where there's no, FCC, right, Federal Communications Committee, to oversee some of these interactions. So it'll be interesting moving forward to see how that all develops for us. And then to kind of close off, Dean, I know we've talked about a lot and the whole gamut of science and psi and magic. And is there any practical exercises? And I know you talk about a few in your book, because I know you've pointed out, like, you're just a researcher, and if you want to learn magic, look at these books. But is there a practical takeaway for the audience to kind of get ground and put into their hands what this all means, and how they can experiment with themselves on these concepts that we've been talking about?
Well, yeah. So I talk about a few simple magical practices that you can do, do-it-yourself magic. Add as well a simple meditative technique, which actually Arnaud Delorme had introduced me to. And so it's a way of doing meditation almost any place and any time for short periods, which will, among other things, tell you very, very clearly that your mind is wandering all over the place. And the goal then is to recognize when mind wandering occurs and to get back into a meditative state, because you need to do that. I mean, some people are lucky and they don't need to meditate. They can do it. They're talented somehow. But for the vast majority of the rest of us, including myself, you need to be able to drop down into that state. So the method that Arno suggested, and which I've adapted a little bit, which I mentioned in the book, is you can do with eyes closed or open. It doesn't really matter. But every out breath, every time you do an exhalation, you start with the number 10. So for the entire exhalation, you're saying 10 all the way down. When you get to the bottom of the breath, it's very easy to turn your mind off for just a smidgen. Like stop, no thought at that point. You just stop it. Now, in the in-breath, you pull 10 back up. So it's 10 all the way back up. And then you get to the top of the breath, you start with 9. And you keep going, 9, all the way down to 0. If you can get to 0, and you'd be breathing slower and slower and slower as you're doing this, you get down to 0 and you're able to actually do the count for real, that's amazing, because most people forget what they're doing around 7. So that's like the elementary stage. And you do that until you can do up to 50. If you can do that 50 back and forth, that's amazing. That's a really good meditation. It's very similar to mind wandering or mindfulness meditation. Next stage, you do the same thing. You start at 10, you breathe out in the exhalation with 10. You get down to the bottom, you empty your mind, which is surprisingly easy to do. And then on the complete inhalation, you retain that state of no mind. So in the beginning, it might be difficult to do that, but nevertheless, you can learn how to do that. And you can retain fairly long period of time with no mind, meaning it's like just awareness. There's nothing else. There's no thoughts. There's nothing else going on. Then you get to the top and you start with 9. You breathe out thinking 9 like a mantra all the way down. You stop thought. You bring it up without thought. And now you do 8. Most people can't get past 10, because the moment you stop mind and you keep it stopped all the way up for the in-breath, it's very, very easy to forget what you were doing. It's like it's all gone. Or you start going off into fantasy and stuff, and you realize 5 minutes later, oh, I was doing something. No, it's really kind of shocking. So when you get to 50, if you can do 50 of those kinds of practices, 50 all the way down to 0 with no mind as half of it, you will be very close to a state of gnosis, because at that point you'll be able to evoke it and like get there quickly, because you'll be able to have an anchor memory as to where you need to be. So I've heard some people have already written, they've read my book, and they write back and say, I was able to do the 10, the first one, the first thing they got down to 0. That's pretty good. And you don't want to do it fast either. I mean, if you do it like you're breathing in and out really fast, that's cheating essentially. You want to do it with a very slow out breath, very slow in breath. It's still, a count of 10 would only take like 3 minutes, 5 minutes maybe. It's much more difficult than most people think.
Yeah, that reminds me of objects in motion like to stay in motion, thoughts in motion like to stay in motion. So that's what I think of in my head in terms of sort of just kind of traveling those physics there of the mind. And I think you've also mentioned like a knot, right? Something physical people can use. Can you describe that too?
Yeah, not magic. So you take a piece of yarn or a piece of leather or something like that, and the idea is that you're binding your thoughts. So you have an intention, you put it in the knot, and as you pull it kinesthetically, you're binding the intention. You've captured it. So you've captured it in the physical world as well, because the intention is coming out of your head. So it's subjective. But you've put it in there and you've captured it. It's in the real world now. So that this magical practice is saying, how do you instantiate something as ephemeral as a subjective experience into the world? Well, that's how you do it. And if you're obsessive like me, you might have to do this many, many times. And you end up like doing it again and again. You're continually binding it. So I like this method because of the kinesthetic feel of it. It's not no longer purely mental. It's like, you're really doing something. So that's a good method too. So in the magician world, sometimes they say, well, now you need to burn this, like to get it, to let it go and let it happen. I like to keep it around because I use it for demonstrations, but also I actually don't want to burn it. I made that thing. I made the little thing and I like it. So I'm going to keep it there now.
It's a what is that, like tying a knot on your finger? It's a nice reminder that that you made
Yeah,
it and it's there and it's materialized
it's
there.
still there.
It's
Yeah.
still
So
there.
I'm not, I mean, I don't dwell on it. I don't even remember what the intention was that went in there, which is actually one of the goals. Like I put something in there, but whatever it is, I'm sure it was fine. So there
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Dean. I love those practical applications because it kind of, again, just grounds and organizes everything that we've spoken about today, from the whole gamut of your book, The Science of Magic, and how, mind and the consciousness, it's sort of, it's fun, right? It's so fun to explore these things. And it would be so much less fun if everything was solid, understood, just one way. And I think you especially in your work do it so eloquently, right? And I think you're built different, as we talked about today, in sort of describing these matters. On top of being a researcher, of course, this is your job and career. I think you explain it so well. So thank you for that. And if the audience would love to reach out to you and get in touch with you or check out your book, where can we send them to?
Well, I'm easy to find, either D. Radin or just Dean at noetic.org. Or look at my website, deanradin.com.
Perfect. And I will leave all those links, and especially the link to Dean's book down below in the show notes. And closing question, Dean. I know you've been doing this for over 40 years. Any aspirations in what you see for the next 40 years to come?
Well, I probably won't be doing this for another 40 years, but what I hope is that the interest, which has always been here, uh, will, first of all, create a career track for younger people who are interested in this so they can study it seriously and like get into it and then do something with it. So the doing something initially will probably be an academic career track. Like either maybe new departments are necessary, or it'll be within a department of physics or department of who knows what. It can be in something so that people who have an interest can actually devote their career to this. That is almost possible or almost existing at this point in the UK. So in the UK, the reason why this happened is because there was a bequeathment to start a chair of parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And that since has produced about 100 PhDs, and many of them have academic jobs now. So it may be in psychology or maybe within a center for studies of these things. But nevertheless, that shows that it is possible in the academic world to actually have a career doing this stuff, which is great. So that's one thing I'm hoping that in probably not even 40 years, less than 40 years, that's going to happen. And the other thing is that some of the practices, like the ones that you're engaged in, will no longer be seen as alternative and complementary, but as this is yet an adjunct in exactly the same way that meditation eventually became paid by insurance and acupuncture and a few other methods. So energy healing, while we don't understand exactly what that is, or biofield, we don't, they work. They work differently for different people, again, because of talent. But nevertheless, that will also eventually be, you would have your insurance pay for a Reiki treatment or something like that. So I think I can envision that will happen. And what also happens, it's so interesting when you look at history, that people forget how controversial topics were at one point. And so I'm hoping that in 10, 20, 30 years from now, people will forget that parapsychology used to be considered controversial, and it will be considered as, well, okay, well, what else is new? What's next? What's the next interesting thing? I'm pretty sure that will happen. It will happen eventually. It's not clear that it will happen in the West first. I think it is much more likely to happen in the East. in metaphorical terms, but places like the Asian world is way more comfortable with these kinds of things, and especially as we see in China, that they're practically on par with the Western world now in terms of their science. So you have the combination of really good science and really open ideas within the culture. They can outstrip us very quickly.
Mm.
Us
Mm.
meaning the U.S.,
Yeah.
maybe pieces of Europe,
Yeah.
which is fine. Somebody's going to figure it out, and if for one reason or another the taboo is still too strong within the Western world, too bad for us.
Mm. Yeah. And hopefully the goal is to pick up this pattern, right? As you're saying, because I think about psychedelics and how controversial that was, just a decade ago. And now it's exploded in terms of acceptance of like, oh yeah, of course psychedelics, help with depression and anxiety and kind of, transforms the mind in so many different ways. So yeah, hopefully people pick up the pattern that this, what we're talking about is not crazy. It's just something new and it's worth exploring.
It's because simultaneously something that is as ancient as anything we know and leading edge at the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it, Dean. Thank you so much, Dean, for this wonderful conversation. Again, I really admire your work and all the wonderful scientists at IONS as I try to keep up with everything that you all are doing. So I will, again, leave all of the information to connect with Dean and to purchase his book, The Science of Magic. And yeah, best wishes, Dean. Thank you so much for your continued courageous, effortless driving, as I say, in this field. And as one person that tries to strive and help the world to make it a better place throughout my own perspective, thank you so much for your time and presence here.
You're welcome.